Hello my friends, and welcome to today's video where I am upcycling some really inexpensive and free items into fresh spring decor for your home. Let's get started. I'm using two of these little wood wall hangings that I picked up at Hobby Lobby on clearance. They were $1.74 a piece, and that on the front is just paper. So I'm going to go ahead and scrape that off as best I can. And whatever little bit is left will be just fine as long as it's adhered down well, because I'm going to decoupage over that with some music sheets. I'm applying my Mod Podge mat, and then I'm going to let that dry and do the iron-on method with these. I adjust that music sheet on there to get it in the position I want, and then bring in my little craft iron with a piece of parchment paper down and just go over it until everything is adhered down really well, especially around those edges. I'm going to do the same thing to the second board. I chose the iron-on method because this paper is really old and brittle, and I felt like doing it onto the wet Mod Podge, it would end up tearing really easily. So this worked out good for this particular type of paper. Now I'm sanding off the excess around those edges. Before I seal this, I am going to apply a coat of my white gesso. It's watered down so that I'm just getting kind of a wash over this so that it just kind of doles out that music sheet a little bit, but it doesn't completely cover it. I did notice some bubbles, so I went ahead and put that parchment paper back down and re-ironed it to flatten them out. Then I'm sealing this with my Duraclear Ultra Matte Sealer. I want to age that white gesso a little bit, so I'm using Dixie Belle's Grunge Glaze, brushing on a coat of this onto each of my boards. You could also just water down the color of paint of your choice and do the same thing. Now here's a little stencil I got from Etsy, and I'm going to use this modeling paste that I picked up from Amazon, and using a little palette knife, I'm stenciling on this one corner pattern onto the first corner. I'm going to bring this down all the way as far as that pattern goes, and then I will be doing this on each corner so that it all attaches. That wasn't how I originally intended on doing it, but I kind of accidentally did it this way on the first two that I did, and so I just had to go with it. I was thinking of just making those lines that come out from the corner shorter and just doing the corners instead of the whole board, but once I was committed, I just followed through and did each corner all the way around the board. On the next one, I'm using a different stencil. I think this was an Amazon stencil, and I'm only doing this pattern on the top and bottom of the board. And the mistake I made with this one was when I lifted it up, it shifted and caught part of that design on there, so I had to go in and kind of smooth that out a little bit. And then when it was dry, I went back over that one spot to try and fix it so it looked a little better. But you just wipe off the edges that gets out from underneath that stencil, let it dry really well, and now we are back to the first one. And I've got a light blue color of chalk paint. It doesn't matter if it's chalk paint or acrylic. This was just the color that I wanted. I watered it down, and I'm brushing that all over the front of the board, and then I'm going to take that sea sponge and do like a reverse sponging where you're actually removing some of that paint with the sponge instead of applying it with the sponge. This is just part of the layering process that I tend to do. Totally unnecessary. You could just decoupage on the music sheet or a book page and then do the later steps that I do. But for some reason, I always have to go down the rabbit hole, and I can't ever get back out until I've done so much stuff that I always wonder if, like, just keep it simple. I can't ever seem to keep it simple. So now I've got some of that blue paint mixed with white, and I'm doing the same thing, but just not as much coverage as I did with the first coat. I'm trying to add in a little bit of not completely white, but a white color, almost like a little cloud effect. And I'm going to do that over the entire piece. And then I'm coming in with oyster beige. I'm going to make like a horizon line here and drag that down over the bottom portion of the board. And then I will be sponging that back as well. With this color, I wasn't getting as much of it off as I wanted to, so I took a baby wipe and dabbed some off with that after doing the sponging. And then I went in with this little bit darker color called burlap. I'm going to mix that in there, sponge it, and baby wipe it off. And then to soften that horizon line so it's not so stark, I'm going to mix some white in with that oyster beige and do it across that middle section there. Same thing, putting it on and then dabbing it back. Now I'm going to take some navy blue paint and mix in a little bit of rich espresso, which is a metallic paint, to give it a little bit of shine. And using a sponge dauber, I'm going to replace that stencil back on, line it up the best I can over that textured stenciling that I did, and then dab this on to add some color to the stencil. This was a little more difficult than if I had just stenciled paint instead of a texture paste, but I didn't really expect it to get complete perfect coverage. I kind of liked that it was hit and miss, so that worked out fine for me. I went ahead and did this to the entire stenciled area, and then I moved on to the next board and did the same thing on the stenciling I did on it. Anywhere I got some bleed through, I just went in with a small paintbrush and touched it up with some of the original paint that was on that area. Once that was dry, I took DIY's Old and Gray and brushed a coat of that onto my boards. I felt like it needed a little something to just kind of bring all those colors and everything together to make it look more, I don't know, uniform, I guess. Just, I don't know. That's just what I did. Okay, so now I'm going to do the edges in my antique wax, brush that on and wipe it back. This gives that, I did sand this down just like, by hand with some fine grit sandpaper just to clean it up. But I like the fact that this gave those edges a nice rich finish. And then I gave the whole front a coat of my ultra matte sealer. Now I'm going to use some of these transfers from Garden Marvels and Iron Orchid's Whispering Willow. I've got two birds and the branches. Okay, so the birds are from Iron Orchid Designs. The branches are from the Garden Marvels. And so I'm going to combine these two so that my little birds will be standing on a branch. So I just kind of fiddled around and figured out where the branch needed to be placed in order for his feet to fit on there the best that they could. Since these weren't made to go together, I was just kind of making it work. And I went ahead and attached that the branch transfer first, once I was sure of the placement, and then I went in and transferred down the bird. You just rub over that with your transfer stick and then burnish it with that transfer sheet. I do the same thing with the other board and the other bird. These little birds are just so darn cute. I'm really happy with how this turned out, and I'm glad I went to the extra effort to do all the things I did to this because I'm really happy with it. I had to trim up his tail because it was like hanging off over all the design and the edges. Now I'm using IOD's Antiquities Stamp and my Stays on Ink in Timber Brown. It's kind of this little, I don't know, like a little medallion type stamp. I'm going to put that down in that blank spot on the right hand side and the left hand side of my birds. And then I will be adding a couple of little butterflies. This is a little book that I got from Temu, and there's just a bunch of different designs in here. I'm going to pick out a couple that I think go best, then fussy cut around each butterfly. I'm just doing one on each board, so it wasn't too bad. They're tiny, but it didn't take very long to cut around these. I went ahead and inked up the back sides of these because I'm going to have their little wings kind of curl upward, and I didn't want just that white on the back showing. So I used the Timber Brown ink on those. What I'm doing here is wrapping that around a paintbrush to get the curve I want, so it's not like a crease in the center of the back. Then I'm just adding some Fabri-Tac glue and applying that down into the center of that stamp. There will be a list of everything that I used in today's video down in the description box, and if you have any questions about something, please hit me up in the comments. I try to cover everything, but I know a lot of times I miss what seems super obvious to explain. The final touch on these is the antique gold rub and buff just around those edges. The next project is making use of some tin cans. I've got two that are a little bit smaller than this one in the middle there. I've already spray painted them with a coat of white primer, and now I'm going to do DIY's White Swan on each of these. I did a couple of coats and then sealed that in with my Duraclear matte sealer. I've got a couple of small styrofoam cones that people use like for Christmas trees, and then a round ball of styrofoam. And I need to cut that in half to make a topper for each of those little cone shapes. They were like the perfect fit, but it looks like an ice cream cone, and I want this to look like a carrot. So the first thing I'm going to do is carve off the round top of the ball that I cut in half. And then I'm going to start shaving around the edges to make that shape look less, it looks very, well, ice, ice cream coney. And it needs, a carrot doesn't go out that wide at the top, like it's not that stark of a difference. So I just kept shaving down around all those edges on both the ball that I cut in half and the cone shape until it was less drastic of a graduated size from the bottom of the carrot to the top. And then I'm going to go ahead and hot glue those on there and then paint this in a color of orange acrylic paint. While we're waiting for that paint to dry, I'm going to cut out two of the carrot images on this napkin. I'm going to be decoupaging these onto that larger tin can. So I'm going to get those cut out, remove the bottom layers of the napkin because I'm only going to use the top layer. And that second layer was really sticky, even with tape added to it to try and help pull it off. It really gave me a fight. But I finally got both of those off, and I'm going to just use a paintbrush dipped in water to go around the edges of the image and then tear that so that it has a nice organic edge to it. For the two smaller cans, I'm going to use these little bunnies from this rice paper. It's a decoupage paper. I think I got it from Etsy, but I'm not really sure because I got it either last year or the year before. I'm going to cut those out the same way I did the carrots with the water and on the paintbrush. Now I'm going to apply this image onto the can using my matte Mod Podge, just lifting back about half of that at a time to apply the Mod Podge, get that all smoothed out, and then go in and do the other half. Once I get that glued down, I don't take extra glue, but just what's already on my brush and go around those edges to make sure they are sealed. Because I don't seal this right away. I like, when you're working with fragile napkins, for me anyway, I like to let it dry first before I go in with another coat of the sealer. And now I'm taking that brush without adding extra glue and just going in down into all those ridges to make sure it's adhered down in there really well. Then once it's dry, I go ahead and do the top coat of Mod Podge. I'm going to do the same exact thing with the bunnies on the two other cans. When that was dry, I'm taking that sea sponge and some more of the DIY white Swan and just going around the edges of that image that I decoupaged on there because they were a little darker and didn't blend as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with the carrot can with Fusion's Chateau because the background for that was darker and I thought this would blend in better. And when it went on wet, it did blend in a lot better, but when it dried, it was too dark. So then I had to go in and lighten that up a little bit using this Country Chic uh, paint that I got from Amazon. It's a nice off-white. If I'd had this color when I started this project, I would have used it instead, I think, because it blended more nicely with the colors in the decoupage paper. I did a third coat, which was just kind of a touch-up coat using that sea sponge. Now back to the carrots. I am taking this orange twine I got from Amazon. I'm going to wrap this around the entire carrot, starting off adding a little bit of hot glue until I get a good start going on this at the bottom. Then I wrap it around and add a little hot glue here and there to make sure it stays in place. And I'm just going to wrap that all the way around up to the top. I have to add a little more glue up at the top because there's just not much for it to grab onto. And then I'm going to go into the top of the carrot, rounding that around the top until I get to the middle and I leave a little opening to add some greenery. This is the greenery I'm going to add to the tops of my carrots. I cut off little pieces. I did, I think, 3 or 4 pieces for each one. I'm going to dig out that hole in the middle there so I can add some hot glue and then stick my little pieces down in there. I'm sealing up the DIY paint with my Duraclear Ultra Matte Varnish because I'm going to be applying Dixie Belle's Grunge Glaze. I'm starting off with a larger can. Just going to brush that on all over and then wipe it back. This will just help give it a little bit of age without making it super dark. I do the same thing to the smaller cans, and that really helped bring together the differences in the color of the background of the decoupage paper and the paint I had put on the can. Now I have 2 little styrofoam eggs that I'm going to give a base coat of white gesso. Then I'm painting one in Dixie Belle's Dusty Blue and the other one in this paint that I've never used before I picked up at Michael's. It's called Fountainhead. It's a really nice pale green, but I thought it would be a little bit darker than it was, so after a couple of coats I did give it a color of sage from a different paint line. I have this little leftover scrap from a craft stick that had been cut down. I'm going to use burnt umber to paint that, as well as a small craft stick. And when those were dry, I gave them a coat of DIY's Old and Gray. I'm going to be making a little sign out of these two pieces, so I wanted it to look weathered to go with the rest of my little arrangement. It wasn't quite light enough for me, so I went in with, I think it's barnwood that I'm using, to dry brush over that and lighten it up a little bit. Now for our eggs, they needed some splatters. I'm using a brown paint to go over them, and then I will come in with some white speckles as well. For my sign, I wanted to spell out the word organic, so I'm using these little snap together letter stamps that you can get on Amazon. I did it 3 times until I got a impression that I was happy with. I heat set that with my heat tool and then tore that out. I didn't have to use a paintbrush dipped in water or anything. I just tore it out with my fingers, and I'm going to decoupage that onto the front of my little signboard. I smoothed that out the best I could with my fingers, and then I grabbed a little piece of saran wrap and smoothed out around that the best I could to make sure there were no wrinkles. And then I will go over that with a top coat of the Mod Podge. To finish off my eggs, I'm just using some Jolie white wax, rubbing that all over with my fingers and then wiping it back with a soft cloth. I'm going to take some Distress Oxide ink in Vintage Photo and brush that onto the edges of my little sign. Now I can attach that sign to the post with a little Titebond Quick and Thick. And while we wait for that to set up, I'm going to start filling up my cans with some Dollar Tree floral foam, cutting it to size to fit, and hot gluing it into the bottom, then adding some hot glue on top, and then putting in some Spanish moss. With that all done, it's time to start adding our embellishments. We're almost done. I'm going to insert a toothpick into the bottom of the carrots and into the bottom side of my eggs. I'm going to trim up that little sign so it has a nice point on the end. And then we can stick these down into that floral foam, add a little hot glue, and secure everything into place. So now I'm just going to go ahead and dress everything up a little bit with some floral picks, some greenery, some baby's breath, little bits and pieces of things that I have on hand that I think would look nice in these arrangements. As I've mentioned before, this is not my area of expertise at floral arranging. I haven't figured it out yet, but so don't let that discourage you from trying this project, because I'm sure yours will turn out beautiful. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video and got some inspiration for some springtime creations. If you need a little more inspiration, I have an entire playlist you can check out. Just click on the link right here. See you next time.